Hello people of YouTube, my name is Brad, this is my channel Animate Orange, and welcome to another ICONX review video. We're going to review this dragon model, this ICONX dragon model from Game of Thrones. Well, this is not my first dragon model, but I think it's probably a little bit more challenging, at least in some areas, than the dragon model I built before. And it's been a while since I built the silver dragon. But I want to say, and unfortunately I don't have it here beside me because I still haven't unpacked it from the move, I want to say the silver dragon just a little bit bigger than that, and that extra size, especially in some of the body pieces, probably made building that model a little bit easier than this one. This one definitely had its challenges, and I feel that some of those challenges were more difficult than they needed to be. In step one, you start off by building these rounded neck pieces right here. And one of my first aggravations right off the bat with building this model is you start off by putting pieces inside of other pieces. And you basically shape these into a circular shape, and then you add another piece in. The tabs bend inwards, which is good. That makes for a cleaner look. And then you add the next part inside the previous part. And I personally found that rather aggravated, and my first thought was, does it need to be this way? Should we be adding it the other way around? But I didn't want to argue with the instructions at first, and I did it that way. And in hindsight, for the neck piece, it probably was better that way. It was a bit frustrating because a lot of these tabs are really tight because you're trying to get tabs in slots around curves. And it makes for a really tight connection where oftentimes you have to kind of work the tab in as you're folding, curving that part around. And the big problem with that is it almost feels like the metal of this model is a little softer than usual, and I don't know why that is. And so from time to time, trying to get those tabs and those really tight connections, the tabs would collapse, fold over, or bend rather than going into place. It didn't have that problem with every tab. Some of those I managed to overcome it, but there was a tab here and there where the tab would collapse, and there wasn't really any coming back from that situation. I think in the neck there's one tab that's only halfway through and bent over, so there's a little bit of a gap in it, and it's not as noticeable looking at it now, but at the time it really aggravated me. I couldn't get the tab to push in any farther, and it really wasn't a situation where I needed to undo it and try again because the tab was starting to weaken from me trying to push it into a place where it didn't want to go and it already bending. But I want to say that this doesn't need to be as difficult as it was, and having built other models with tight connections like that, I'm wondering why it is that Metal Earth hasn't tried to make maybe their slots is a little bit wider in situations like that, so you have more room to get that tab into its appropriate spot. And I'm wondering if it's just something that they just haven't done, or if there's a reason they haven't done that. And this model, I think, would benefit greatly in a lot of areas for having slots that are just a little wider than usual to give you that extra room to slide things into place. Some instances may benefit from having an angle tab, but I think for most of these, since those tabs are bent to get into place, the angle wouldn't work, but having a slightly wider slot would help, and it would alleviate a lot of the frustration with this build. And I'll go into more of that here in just a moment because this situation repeats itself. In step two, you form the main body, and it's much bigger and easier to work with, and most of those tabs come together fairly easily. But again, there were a couple of areas where there was a size difference, where maybe the next part was that you're trying to fold around the previous part was smaller, and it's a tougher stretch to get that part and that tab stretched out far enough into its slot. And I think there is one tab in here that I just gave up trying to get into place because if I kept going it was just going to break off anyway. So I folded that tab in. Fortunately, on both sides there are two tabs holding each side on, because it's, like everything else, starts off flat and then the pieces curve around, and as the pieces curve around there's two tabs on each piece. And the lower tab I got into place, but the middle tab on one area I couldn't. I folded it in out of the way and just kept on because fortunately it was enough there to hold it, but getting that one tab in, it just wasn't going to go. And the metal was weakening and bending, and again, this is something that reoccurred numerous times in this model. Steps 4, 5, and 6, you're building all of these round tail pieces and you build them in sections. Step 4 has 6 pieces you put together, and then you move on to step 5, which has 5 pieces that connect together. Then you move on to step 6, which has 5 separate pieces to put together, and then you kind of put those to the side. Now with steps 4, 5, and 6, in the instructions with 4, 5, and 6, you're starting off with a larger piece and adding on the smaller pieces inside. And to me, that didn't make sense to do it that way. It didn't make sense to try and put pieces inside of other pieces. It made more sense to go backwards, and that's what I did. With step 4, I started with part 16, added part 15 on top. It seemed to go a little better that way because you're trying to put a part on top of another part. So as you're folding 15 around, putting the tabs into their place, and then you reach in and fold or twist the tabs. Now all the instructions say to fold the tabs, and 99% of the ones inside these body pieces I folded, but in hindsight, I don't think folding is absolutely necessary. Twisting will work just fine because they're all hidden tabs, and if it's easier to get to twist it, why not do it that way? I didn't, but I see no problem in just twisting them rather than fighting with trying to fold them, which probably would have saved me a little headache. After I got part 15 and 16 connected, I added on part 14. Got that connected, added on part 13, then 12, then 11. I did it backwards, and I really think that worked better than what the instructions were suggesting. I did the same for 5. I started with part 21, then 20, then 19, 18, and 17. With part 6, same thing. Started with 26, then 25, then 24, 23, and 22. And that seemed to go a little smoother. It alleviated some of the stress of fighting with this model and trying to put pieces inside of other pieces. Did I still have some trouble with the tabs? Yes. I still had the occasional tab that didn't want to go into place. And I fought through it as best I can, whether it be the tab didn't go in all the way or the tab was just completely ignored. I will say with part 6, not all the tabs had 3 tabs connecting them. The smaller pieces only had 1 tab connecting them. It did cheat a little bit because 1 tab holding 2 little pieces together is just not going to stay 99% of the time. So when I got those connected, I dropped a little bit of UV glue on there, solidified that just to hold the part on rather than fighting with it constantly falling out during the build. And that helped tremendously. Was it necessary to build the model? No, but it made it easier to keep the pieces together until it was complete. And I'm okay with that. Steps 8 through 12, you build these legs, and I will admit I didn't show it entirely in my build video, but the first leg that I built, this hip section in here, I can't remember which side it was, I ended up folding and unfolding 3 times because, again, we're dealing with a situation where it's difficult to display a 3D model on a 2D piece of paper, and I got it right the first time, but when I went to fold the next section of the leg and add it to it, I had doubts and thought I'd misinterpret it because things didn't seem to line up according to the picture that it was showing me, the drawing. And I folded it the other way. That didn't work either, and then I realized, yes, I had done it correct the first time. It's one of those situations where if you look at the part and the way it's curved, it's easy to misinterpret and thinking while they're saying to fold stuff this way, maybe they're saying to fold it that backwards. And I interpreted it correctly, then doubted myself, and then realized I was right the first time. Even with that, it's an odd connection. It's another situation where you've got 3 tabs in a very tight area that I had to struggle and fight to get all 3 tabs in. And I had to kind of, you've got the piece, you've got the flat tab sticking out, and it bends, let's say it bends this way. But then I had to kind of bend them this way a little bit, which is not an easy thing to do and really opens you up to the risk of breaking or damaging that tab. There were a couple of times I felt I had to do that to get the tab to go into its space because the tab is so long that it adds to the distance it needs to travel to get in to a slot, and that's where having a wider slot would accommodate that extra piece sticking out. Sure, the slots line up with the tabs when they're connected, but you've got to roll them around to be connected, and they kind of swing outwards, and that caused issues. So many different connections that it made what could have maybe been a 3-hour build into a 4-hour build, in my opinion. Once you struggle past getting the legs and the feet together, which by the way, the feet are only held on by 2 tabs, and you kind of have to do your best with that. It looks like there's 3 slots there for them to connect to, but there's only 2 tabs, and one of the tabs doesn't come together in an obvious way to its slot. You kind of got to hook it and maneuver it and work it the best you can. Maybe there's not much better they could have done with that connection, but it's a weird connection and the feet are rather shaky, but they're there. From there, we move on to making the wings, which are basically consisting of numerous different flaps that go in between these areas. Not terribly difficult. You just put a curve in those pieces, line up the tabs, and add them. I folded them all over. They're all folded inwards, so the tabs kind of stick out a little bit. I tried to fold a few of them outwards so they'd be a little more hidden. That didn't go as well. It just, something about it didn't want to be as secure. Folded them inward, they folded in easily, they folded in securely, and it held apart. Folding them outward, it was a fight. They didn't want to fold. The part wanted to twist. It just didn't work as well. And by this point, I was kind of aggravated with a number of the things and decided, you know, we're just going to fold them out inward as they are. They'll be a little bit more visible, but it'll be secure and we'll move through this. And that was kind of the attitude I had at that point. You could really fold them either way. Once you get done with that, you've got this main spine area that you then begin adding the body parts to. You've got a couple of thin pieces back here on the back of the neck, and the instructions say to fold those over. That was a pain in the butt. It was not easy to do, to fold them and hold on to them. I got one down, I tried to fold the other, the first piece fell back off. I don't even know why. It shouldn't have, because I bent the tabs in opposite directions, but in reality, there's no clear reason as to why they're folded. They don't need to be saving room. The next part that goes on goes around them. So I ended up twisting them, and that didn't cause any problems. If I'd have just twisted them to begin with, I would have added the parts really quickly, moved on, and been less aggravated. Then you add the next section, which is a bit of a challenge, trying to squeeze those tabs into their place because they don't all want to line up perfectly. There's a little bit of manipulation going on, which isn't that unusual. Then you add on the wing sections, which is a little bit of a challenge. Again, not too bad. And then you add on this main part of the body, which first connects to the pieces here, and then you get the tabs in the back into place. A little bit funky working that in, stretching parts and squeezing them so that they'll go in, but doable. And then you start adding in the tail sections a piece at a time, connecting the tabs to the main body and then trying to work the tabs into the back. And one of the situations I ran into, because you're trying to squeeze parts inside of other parts, once you squeeze and get it in there so the tabs will go out, then it's difficult to reach in there and spread the tabs back out. Kind of a flaw. Helps if you have some tools to do it, but it added some of the difficulty to it. Once you get all these pieces on, then it's a matter of adding some of the small details of the tail and head. Now this tail piece does have parts that need to be folded over, because if you twist those, you will not be able to get the two sides together properly, and I did fight with that, because I originally twisted them because I didn't want to bother with it, and then I realized, okay, I should have folded them over. However, because I twisted them and got them on there securely, it was easier to then go back one at a time and fold the tabs over, because the parts were being held on by other twisted tabs. So really, while they needed to be folded over and I twisted them, the way that I did it worked out beneficial into getting it together cleanly the first time. Because I spent a little time twisting and then untwisting tabs, but because I twisted them first, the parts were on secure, and then I could work with the folded tabs and not have things just fall off all over the place. So that worked out fairly well. And then your last steps are to assemble the headpiece, which is just a couple of pieces, not too difficult. Stretch the sides over the tabs, bend them back, and then shape the wings, which if you watch my build video at the very end of it, I forgot to actually curve the wings down and ended up doing that off camera without thinking. But the wings actually being curved down are, for the most part, what the weight of this model sit on. The legs really aren't there to be propped up like the Silver Dragon. The legs do kind of allow you to stand the model back on its back legs. This one, you're resting on those bent down wings, so you do need to spend some time bending that down and shaping that so that it holds itself. Now that I've gone through the whole process, and I've certainly made several comments about the difficulty of this model, I think there are some areas where, if I ask the question of myself, if I were to do this again, how would I do it? What would I do differently? This is definitely a situation where there are some things that I would do things differently. For one, with, say, these spine pieces up here on the neck, I wouldn't fight with trying to fold those over. I would have just twisted them and moved on. With these neck and tail pieces, I might not have felt fault so much with trying to fold those over on the inside and just twisted them because it's inconsequential. You know, obviously I know the proper way to do this leg now, but I kind of wished I had listened to myself the first time around and put it together without spending more time folding and unfolding. But those are the main things. But there's not really much I could do about that because I was trying to do it right and second guessing myself and guessed wrong. But the main thing is not spend so much time twisting tabs when it would have been just as good to just, or excuse me, not spend so much time trying to fold over difficult tabs when it would have been just as good to twist them. And this tail piece, I would have went in knowing that, alright, I'm going to twist these tabs to get started. Once it's on, then I'll fold them over and make it clean. And I wouldn't have saved much time there because that's ultimately what I did, but I would have went in with that mindset, which would have, you know, saved me some of the aggravation. Things that I wish were different that are outside of my control is I wish a lot more of the slots had wider slots so that the tabs could slide in to where they needed to be a lot easier, and maybe that would have taken a lot of the aggravation off of my shoulders in building this model and made it a little more fun. The end result is really cool. It turned out better than I expected. This is one of those models as I'm building it and as I'm going through the frustration, I'm like, this is going to look like garbage and I'm not even going to be impressed. But now that I've done it and now that it's all together, it looks pretty cool, even though I haven't seen any of the shows or read the books. You know, one thing I could have said I'd like to have done differently, and I thought about it, you know, I mentioned how I did these tail sections backwards on the instructions, and I thought about that ahead of time. So I did do that the right way. I don't regret making that decision. I think that helped a lot. I thought about whether or not I would have liked to have done the neck done it backwards like I did the tail pieces, but because with the neck you were going from bigger to smaller already. If I would have started with the big piece and tried to wrap the smaller pieces around it, that would have introduced a different problem of trying to squeeze those bigger pieces and smaller pieces in ways to make them work. So really, for that, kind of difficult to explain it, but because you're going smaller and trying to cram bigger pieces inside, that's difficult just because you're trying to connect these different size pieces. But at least with doing the larger pieces, you can bend them out of shape to get the tabs and then straighten it back out when you're done, and that worked out okay. It was aggravating, but there's really no way around that. If I'd have been trying to add the bigger pieces over the smaller pieces, I would have still had to bend pieces out of shape, and coming from that approach might not have been as easy. So really can't say. I thought at one point maybe I would have done that differently, but in hindsight, now that it's all done, I don't think that would have helped any at all. I think that might have actually added to the frustration. The model took just short of 4 hours to build. It is a beautiful looking model. I'm surprised that the wings are actually supporting the majority of the weight and the legs really aren't doing much. But if you look at the picture, the way it's drawn or shown, it kind of makes sense. The color looks really cool. It's got a bit of a shine to it. It's a dark color. It does look like a rather sinister looking dragon, and even has the red tongue poking out at the end. So it is an awesome model. It is a headache to build, and it is very frustrating to build, and just from what I remember, a lot more aggravating than the silver dragon was. Part of that may just be because it has smaller pieces in the body and neck to put together, and I think possibly even more pieces. But I have to go back and compare them a little bit more. It's been a while since I've done that. Is it worth the aggravation? If you're a Game of Thrones fan, absolutely. If you're a big dragon fan, yes, it's worth the aggravation for me. Just barely. At some point I would like to watch the movies and read the books, but right now there was a little bit of why am I doing this going on. But in the end, it does look like an amazing model, and I can wow my friends that do like Game of Thrones. So there is that. Do want to thank Fascinations Metal Earth for sending me this model to review. This is my honest review. I think there's some improvements that could be made in the model to make it a little bit easier to build. I think this model was more aggravating than it needed to be. I think a couple of the instruction steps probably could be changed to make it easier, and those slots could be widened so that you don't have to fight so hard to get the tabs into their slots. As far as the metal having that feeling that it's going to bend easier, I don't know what's causing that. I don't know if maybe it's the paint on top. It occurred to me that maybe that underneath this was actually a gold or brass type color just painted over, and so it wasn't magnetic, but it is magnetic. I did get a magnet stuck to it at one point. There was an incident where a couple of water spilled over and things need to be moved quickly, and in that process I incidentally discovered it is indeed magnetic. So it appears to be the usual metal just coated in color. So maybe the color has something to do with it, or the process of painting it has something to do with it, or maybe it's just me. And I'll leave it at that. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting this channel so I can continue to make these build videos, and I guess my time may be up, so I guess I better finish up. The computers are shutting down behind me, and thank you to Metal Earth for sending me this model to review. As always, keep on keeping on.